All right, I'm finally back. I've been on military orders again, which is why I wasn't uploading anything. But today I'm just going to do a really informal video. I'm not going to do any editing. I'm just kind of recording this on PowerPoint just to give you guys some content. This is what won the vote, I believe, last time before I left. You guys wanted me to talk about divorce and remarriage, marital indissolubility in the British Isles. So I'm just going to, pump through this and then upload this hopefully later today. And then tomorrow, if I remember, I'll try to upload a quick stream giving an update because, as most of you guys know, I'm writing a manuscript book kind of on this subject where I go into much more detail on all of these things that you guys may or may not be interested in. And I'm leaning towards self-publishing it so I can kind of do it like Duong did and just put a free PDF online because my goal is not necessarily to make money off this stuff. It's just to, hopefully provide some interesting content to people who are nerdy enough like me to watch videos like this. So with that, let's start talking about remarriage in the British Isles. So England is one of the vectors through which the Byzantine abuses, which began to relax on divorce and remarriage, began to be introduced in the West. As we noted in the first couple episodes of this series, prior to the Council of Nicaea, it was pretty rigorous. I mean, the Catholic view of marital indissolubility was everywhere. And as far as pastoral application, it was often stricter than what we see even today. Definitely stricter than what we see today, especially in the United States. And, while these novelties introduced by the Byzantines in England, produced controversy, indissolubility eventually triumphed. And it should be noted that, it was through England and, through Theodore of Canterbury, or Theodore of Tarsus, as he's also known, that these ideas were introduced into the, a land of the Franks. And this is why you had various Frankish councils that would include various liberal practices that led to controversy. So you had kind of dueling councils going against one another, various pronouncements from Rome on the subject. But once again, eventually the, historical teaching of indissolubility as well as the scriptural one triumphed. The other thing that's kind of important to note here is that sexual morality of the Celtic people in the British Isles was lacking pre-Christianity, which isn't surprising. Some evidence for this includes, St. Bede talks about how in the Pictish kings, for example, there was never patrilineal succession. So he actually theorized it may have been matrilineal. And the reason he theorizes that was the case is because fathers could never be certain that the kid was actually theirs. So it went through the mother rather than through the father. Other scholars have debated this, saying it wasn't necessarily matrilineal, but it is a fact that it wasn't patrilineal like it was later in the Middle Ages. And the scholars who kind of doubt Bede will say stuff like, oh, maybe it was a council of elders would come together and choose the next king. But regardless, the fact is it was very clear that sexual immorality was rampant. So not only do you have things being brought externally from the Byzantines, but you also had some issues internally from their pre-Christian culture, which led to conflict between the church as well as the secular people on divorce and remarriage in the English Isles. So we're actually going to talk a bit about some of this secular, conflict first. So let's talk about King Howell Da, and I'm probably mispronouncing the last name, so if anyone knows how to say it, because they know more about Celtic pronunciation or Welsh pronunciation, feel free to go ahead. Now, King Howell Da of the Welsh passed laws that were quite liberal on divorce and remarriage. And, Oscar Watkins even said, quote, that this was the lowest point ever reached by Christian legislation in the matter of marriage, end quote. And, these laws had a lot of crazy rulings, one of which that I thought was the most interesting and also the most, again, insane, was the existence of probationary marriages, which could be dissolved at will. So he basically thought that you had to have marriage test drives before you could get fully married. So he was definitely the most liberal person on divorce and remarriage during this era, during the post-Christian era, that is. And is also an example of how, the English clerics basically had their work cut out for them in ensuring that Christian morality would get imposed on the English peoples. So we're going to begin by discussing the First Synod of St. Patrick. Now, I put unknown date because the date range is pretty wide. It's from the 5th to the 10th century, but it falls squarely into the timeline that I've been talking about, how I'm kind of researching, pre-1066, pre-1054 in the early church. So the 19th canon reads simply as follows, quote, "A Christian woman who enters into an honorable marriage and afterward leaves her first husband and joins herself in adultery shall be excommunicated." Pretty straightforward. So a woman who is married, then attempts to divorce, then attempts to either form another relationship or form another marriage with a man is considered adulteress. The clear implication is because the original marriage bond is not broken by the separation/divorce. So the canon upholds marital indissolubility. It holds that divorce cannot break the marriage bond. It does not free you to marry a second time, and very clearly, very succinctly, teaches the Catholic view of marriage and indissolubility. Now we're going to talk about the second Synod of St. Patrick, and this one definitely the date's unknown, but it is considered of quote-unquote considerable antiquity. So before we get into these canons, this council does not hold to the Catholic view of marital indissolubility. We're not going to cope around it because we don't cope on this channel. I just read the sources and we come to our own conclusions based on the original sources. So it says in the 26th canon, quote, "Hear the Lord saying, he who clings to a prostitute becomes one body with her. Likewise, let the adulteress be stoned, that is, let her die for this vice so that she ceases to grow in sin. For she did not cease to commit adultery. Again, if a woman has been defiled by adultery, she can return to her former husband. Furthermore, a man is not permitted to divorce his wife except for the cause of fornication. Yet if he does so for this reason and marries another, as if after the death of the first, they are not forbidden." So we clearly see in this case that you are allowed to be married for the cause of fornication, for adultery, and that if you marry another, as is the case of the death of the first, that's not forbidden, that's allowed. So that's contrary to current Catholic teaching. Now, you might have an Anglican or an Orthodox or some sort of Protestant say, aha, Catholics are debunked or whatever, but once again, non-Catholics allow for divorce typically for more reasons than merely adultery. So this doesn't really comport with their current practices and theologies either. So it's not necessarily a win for either case, but it does show that there's a certain laxity in this canon that doesn't exist in current Catholic teaching. And the 28th canon says as follows, quote, by the same principle, the first vows and first marriages must be upheld, nor should the initial unions be annulled unless they have been tainted by adultery. Once again, it allows you to break the marriage bond if it has been tainted by adultery. So this only allows for one reason for divorce and remarriage, that is adultery, but it's still allowed for it, and therefore we have to consider it as holding a non-Catholic position. Even though, once again, this is something that I've said in I think almost every video, just because it doesn't go with the Catholic position doesn't mean it proves alternate positions that exist out there. These are two different things. Going against Catholic doesn't necessarily mean it goes towards whatever religion you are or want to be. I wouldn't say that this canon, for example, backs up the Orthodox position or backs up the Anglican position or backs up most Protestant positions, because again, most of these individuals support divorce and remarriage for more reasons than merely adultery. But again, this does hold to a non-Catholic position. So now we're going to talk about the penitential of Finian, or also known as Saint Finian. So this would have been in the early to mid 6th century. So what's kind of interesting about this book is that when he closes it, he basically states that he's just repeating what he has seen in scripture, tradition, and the views of learned men. So he's giving no indication that he's just trying to make up things or that he is the origin of these things. He's merely attempting to document and to put forth what he believes is the common best practices of his contemporaries. So this work is actually unique in that it can give us some insight as to what the people generally at the time were practicing. And it also may give us some insight as to the views of continental Europe, because Oscar Watkins has speculated that he likely relieved his theological training in Gaul. So let's look at Canon 41. So divorce is prohibited in Canon 41 where the wife is barren, and that both ought to dwell in continence. So you can't just divorce your wife because she's not producing you an heir. Canon 42 says it prohibits wives, so there's a typo in there, sorry, prohibits wives from divorcing husbands, and if they do so, she is to remain unmarried and be reconciled with her husband. Sounds like the Catholic view. You can't just divorce and remarry, and if you do divorce, you should be reconciled with your husband or remain unmarried thereafter. So that teaches the Catholic position. Canon 43. So Canon 43 now prohibits men from remarrying, even if the separation was due to adultery. Once again, men are prohibited from remarrying, even if they divorce their wives due to adultery. It says this, I'll quote, "If a man's wife commits fornication and cohabits with another man, he ought not to take another wife while his wife is still alive." So that comports with the Catholic view. Canon 45 continues with the same logic, quote, "So also a woman, if she has been sent away by her husband, must not mate with another man so long as her former husband is in the body. But she should wait for him unmarried in all patient chastity, in hope that God may perchance put patience in the heart of her husband. But the penance of these persons is this, that is, of a man or woman who has committed fornication. They shall do penance for an entire year on an allowance of bread and water separately, and shall not sleep in the same bed." So, what can we conclude from this? One, in Canons 43 and 45, we see both men and women are prohibited from remarrying after divorce. We also see that even adultery isn't a reason to remarry after divorce. If you do engage in adultery, you have to engage in penance, because that's a terrible sin, and even part of his penance is the modern equivalent of sleep on the couch for a long time. So overall, I would say that St. Finian provides a witness to the Catholic Church's adherence to marital indissolubility in Wales in the 6th century, as well as potentially providing insight as to what the Gauls were thinking on the matter, given that it's potentially possible that he received his theological training there, and he clearly holds to the Catholic position of indissolubility and a prohibition on remarriage. So we now have the penitential of Cummian. So this is named after Cummian, who is an Irish abbot, and Joyce considers this evidence that indissolubility was the presumed position by the English Church and the English ecclesiastics prior to the introduction of Byzantine abuses by Theodore of Canterbury, who we will discuss in a couple slides. McNeill and Gamer also believe that it is a genuine penitential. So Canon 29 reads, quote, "If any man's wife deserts him and returns again, he shall receive her without payment, and she shall do penance for 1 year with bread and water. The man shall do likewise if he has taken to another wife." So why do I think this canon teaches indissolubility? So the first thing is that it requires a husband receive the wife if she has returned after a divorce, which implies that the marital bond remains valid even after separation. The second point is that the fact that a man must engage in penance if he has taken a second wife in the interim shows that the second union is sinful/adulterous. And, once again, it shows that the bond of the first marriage trumps whatever the second union is, especially given that it mandates reunion to the first spouse. And then the third thing is that while we might disagree with some of the pastoral applications here, we could say that the actual theological teaching of the canon is correct. So overall, I would say that this is evidence for marital indissolubility in the English Church in antiquity. So now let's discuss Theodore of Canterbury, also known as Theodore of Tarsus, because that's where he was from. Now, an interesting point that I believe it was George Joyce, so I guess I didn't cite him on the slide, but George Joyce discusses how Pope Vitalian was concerned that Theodore would actually introduce foreign Byzantine practices unknown in Britain. And as far as marriage goes, the concern was valid. And this actually goes back to one of my early videos on how the English Church was not Orthodox, because you see a lot of these guys online that'll say, oh, well, before 1066, these guys were Eastern Orthodox, they were Byzantine. But I mean, if that was the case, why would Pope Vitalian think that sending some Greek guy hundreds of years before the schism would be leading to foreign practices being brought to Britain? So total random aside there. But yeah, so let's talk about Theodore of Canterbury. Now, there's a ton I could put on here. And again, in the book, in the manuscript that I currently have, I go through a lot more of his writings. But here I'm just going to hone in on Canon 5. And then we're going to talk a little bit about a table that I adapted from Oscar Watkins' book. So Canon 5 says this, quote, "If the wife of anyone commits fornication, he may put her away and take another. That is, if a man puts away his wife on account of fornication, if she was his first, he is permitted to take another, but if she wishes to do penance for her sins, she may take another husband after 5 years. So clearly, if your wife commits adultery, you can put her away, take another wife. And likewise, wives who are the guilty party in this, if they do penance for the sins, they can also take another husband after 5 years. So once again, no coping. This teaches a non-Catholic position. Now, from Oscar Watkins' book, he actually notes that Theodore's views on this essentially are just copy and paste from Justinian's divorce laws. And, I probably should have filmed the Byzantine video first, even though that came in second in the voting, just because, it would kind of give some insight as to why Theodore is teaching this stuff and how this even came about. Because as I've noted in my previous videos, this isn't the ancient teaching. Prior to Nicaea, East and West, indissolubility was the norm. And even after the Council of Nicaea, you can make a strong case that indissolubility was the norm even in the East. However, after Justinian, this begins to change, and it's top down. It's from the secular government into the church that this happens. Excuse me, that this happens. But essentially, on the left of this table, you see the marital situation. In the second, column here, you see Theodore's penitential. And then in the third, you have what the Eastern churches after Justinian began to teach as a result of Justinian's marriage laws. So in the first situation, you have adultery of the wife. Both of them allow you to divorce the wife and then remarry. Now you have the situation of adultery of the husband. In the case of Theodore's penitential, it's a wife may not divorce except to join a monastery. Eastern churches, a wife may not divorce. For religious life, so one of the spouses wants to become a monk or a nun, it allows you to do it with various consents. This is the same teaching. So reconciliation of the adulterous wife. So a husband may restore an adulterous wife, but if he does so, he must undergo penance. And the old Roman law punished reconciliation. However, Novell 134 says that a wife must enter a convent unless the husband reconciles her within 2 years. And then later on, they eventually began teaching reconciliation, somewhat aligning with Theodore here. Subsequent incapacity. So Theodore teaches if either be overtaken with incapacity subsequent to the marriage, the other may remarry. Now, on the case for the Eastern churches after Justinian, is a ground for divorce and remarriage, but the issue must have existed before solemnization, so slight difference there. Marital situation number 6, desertion by the wife. The husband may remarry after 5 years. And then under the Eastern churches, it's the husband may remarry if she lives elsewhere with her parents. So 7, which is captivity of a wife with violence or without violence. This is important because, as you know, especially in the East, there was a lot of violence, and even in the English church, because they were periodically being invaded by Vikings. So that's a pretty important, pastoral concern. Vikings come in, they kidnap and do bad things to your family and wife and whatnot. Conversely, you're in Eastern Rome, maybe the Persians or maybe, one of these nomadic, Mongol or the Huns or whatever come in and do the same thing. So for 7, captivity of the wife with and without violence. So the husband may remarry after 1 year if and then it says if A, so with violence, the wife may reclaim the husband on return. Now for B, so without violence, the wife may not reclaim the husband on return. So I don't really know how captivity without violence would work, but whatever. And then for the Eastern churches after Justinian, it is the husband may remarry after a time. Old Roman law would not allow the wife to reclaim on return, but for Eastern church later on, she could. And then the captivity of the husband. So the wife is allowed to remarry after 5 years. And then for the Eastern churches, if your husband gets captured, a wife may remarry after a time, but must return to the husband if he reappears and chooses to claim her. So you can see that there's a lot of similarities between these two, and this is kind of where Theodore's coming from when he's writing his penitential. Now the question is, how was Theodore received? Like, is this just his opinion? Is he a one-off? Is this a common opinion in England? And was his opinion adopted later on? So according to Oscar Watkins, these provisions were not found again in authoritative form later on. So he says no, they were not received. George Joyce likewise says that these penitentials received no official sanction. And, evidence the fact that they didn't receive official sanction is at the Synod of Hertford, which we'll get into momentarily, which is actually a council over which Theodore presided. So Theodore was there and was heading the council. That already canonically and officially prohibited remarriage in England. And then we also have various subsequent penitentials by St. Bede and Egbert, which pull a lot from Theodore's work, but they conspicuously exclude the sections endorsing remarriage. So overall, Theodore's view was treated and should be viewed as aberrant and not the norm in England. In other words, based on the prior evidence that I've presented and the evidence we're about to go through, clearly the overall trend in England is marital indissolubility. This sort of thing, like Theodore allowing for remarriage after adultery, is clearly not the norm. So let's talk a little bit about Egbert, because I just mentioned that. So Egbert was the Archbishop of York at the time of Theodore, and he says as follows. Question. If a lawful marriage is dissolved by mutual agreement due to infirmity of the husband or wife, is it permissible for the healthy spouse who is unable to remain chaste to enter into a second marriage, provided the infirm spouse consents and promises to maintain perpetual continence? What does your holiness judge concerning this? Response. No one acts against the gospel or the apostle without facing retribution. So he's saying that if you do this, if you take a second wife, you're going against the gospel, you're going against the apostle Paul, and you're going to face retribution. Therefore, we do not grant approval to adulterers. So he's now even stating that taking the second marriage is clearly the same as being an adulterer. And then he says this, yet we do not impose burdens on anyone that cannot be borne without peril, while we confidently uphold the commandments of God. For these hindered by infirmity from fulfilling marital duties, we leave much to the judgment of God. Lest we seem to condone adulterers through silence, or the devil, who deceives adulterers, rejoice in their sins. Hear further, what God has joined together, let no one separate. And again, let anyone accept this who can. For often, through changes in circumstances, necessity breaks the law. What did David do when he was hungry, yet he was without sin? Therefore, in certain matters, a definitive judgment should not be imposed, but counsel must be risked for the salvation of others on this condition, that the one who has vowed continence in no way is permitted to enter into second marriage while the former spouse lives. So let's interpret this a bit. So the theology is sound. He states that remarriage violates the gospel, it violates the writings of the Apostle Paul, and is clearly against divine law. And he's taking for granted that his readers are going to be treating and viewing remarriage as adultery. However, for the pastoral guidance, he says that a definitive judgment should not be imposed. So, why is this? So Theodore, despite his aberrant, marriage theology, was a theological titan. He was a very, theologically rigorous individual. So being somewhat deferential to that shortly after his reign does make sense. So he's not adopting what Theodore said. Because he's going from remarriage is adultery. We know that, as we just taught, that Theodore said, but it's okay sometimes. So he's looking at this and he's going, well, I don't want to be against Theodore. He was just there. But he doesn't want to adopt what Theodore is saying either, because it's clearly against what Egbert is reading in the Gospels. So what he's basically saying is, for pastoral guidance, we don't know. So Watkins counts him as an error, saying that Egbert is the last important document of the English Church, which is untrue to the teaching of Holy Scripture and Catholic antiquity. But really, reading through it, I would say that Egbert was still more right than wrong, because he's clearly stating that indissolubility is the gospel teaching. It is the teaching of St. Paul, and he's just kind of quibbling on pastoral matters because he's a little bit confused based on what Theodore basically decreed just a couple years prior. So I would rate this as lean Catholic, but you can do whatever you want with this church. Clearly, individuals like Oscar Watkins think that he's teaching marital dissolubility of some form. I don't think that's the case. I think his theology is sound here, even though I disagree with the application of it somewhat. So I'm ranking it as lean as Catholic, but you can basically rank it however you want in your own evidentiary test, because the goal of this channel is just to kind of share things I read, and you guys can come to your own conclusions. So the Synod of Hertford. Now, the Synod of Hertford's easy because it's actually very straightforward. Now, Hertford was the first general council of the British Church, so its rulings should hold, in my opinion, extreme weight in an evidentiary balancing test. Lots of bishops were there. It was the first general council of the British Church, set a lot of things in stone. And in chapter 10, it says this, quote, that unlawful wedlock alone is permissible. That lawful wedlock alone is permissible and incest is forbidden, and that no man may leave his lawful wife except as the gospel provides for fornication. And if a man puts away his own wife who is joined to him in lawful marriage, he may not take another if he wishes to be a good Christian. He must either remain as he is or else be reconciled to his wife. So this terse and straightforward statement by the Synod is, I think it's pretty clear. Remarriage is forbidden on the grounds that it contradicts the gospel, and if you do get divorced, you must either, quote, remain as he is or be reconciled to your wife. This is basically the Catholic teaching on divorce and remarriage, codified by by the Synod of Hertford in 673 AD, and this was the official teaching because this is what the General Council of the English Church was teaching at the time in the 7th century. So, in my opinion, this is a huge piece of evidence. It outweighs a lot of stuff, and it's clearly the official teaching of the English Church. And again, it's of note that Theodore was the head of this council. So even though he disagreed, the actual teaching of the English Church is obviously in favor of the Catholic position, and Theodore was not able to stop that from being put into the official teaching of the English Church. So let's talk a little bit about Saint Adamnan. So Adamnan was an abbot of Iona, which is an island near the border between the Picts and the Scots. He himself was Irish, and he had close ties to the Northumbrian Church. So I would say that his views provide insight as to what all of these regions in the British Isles were teaching: the Northumbrians, the Picts, the Scots, and the Irish. Now, his canons prohibit remarriage even in the case of adultery, which is once again the Catholic position. Of a wife who is a harlot, thus the same man explained that she will be a harlot who cast off the yoke of her own husband and is joined to a second or third husband, and her husband shall take another wife while she lives. For we do not know whether that verdict which we read in the Questions of the Romans was attested by acceptable or false witnesses. So again, we clearly state that remarriage, even in the case of adultery, is not allowed. To give a little bit of context about the verdict on the Romans, there's kind of debates as to what he's referencing to on this. I'll probably get a bit into this actually in a different video. But one possible interpretation is that Theodore's position was seen as the Roman one because it was the Pope who sent him to England. But regardless, St. Adamnan clearly believes that marital indissolubility is the teaching of the Church and that you cannot remarry even if adultery is involved. So let's talk about Venerable Bede, who's also writing in the 8th century. So we can get his position on the commentary on Mark. I should also note that in his the previous thing I just noted on the Synod of Hertford was actually taken from his work on the Ecclesiastical history of Britain. So he's already relaying the Synod of Hertford. So in a way, since that's what he was relaying, that was also an example of his opinion as well. But we can also look at the commentary on Mark, where he also gets more into his personal opinion on this. So in Mark 10:9, we see as follows, quote, "In Mark 10:9, what God has joined together, making one flesh of man and woman, this no human can separate except perhaps God alone. A human separates a marriage when, out of desire for a second wife, they dismiss the first. God separates whom he had joined when, by mutual consent for the services of God, because the time is urgent, we live with our wives as though not having them. There is, therefore, only one carnal cause for separation, fornication, and one spiritual cause, the fear of God, so that a wife may be dismissed, as many are recorded to have done for the sake of religious devotion. However, no cause is prescribed by God's law, allowing another marriage to take place while the spouse who was dismissed is still alive. So, even in adultery, even if your spouse wants to go join a convent, you cannot remarry while the other spouse is still alive. So clearly he is teaching that the marital bond survives and is only broken by death. And, in this case, remarriage is only allowed if your first spouse has ceased. In other words, he's teaching marital indissolubility. He is teaching the Catholic doctrine of marital indissolubility. So once again, another strong example of the English Church adhering to the Catholic view on divorce and remarriage. Now we can talk a little bit about Archbishop St. Dunstan of Canterbury. So this is a little bit later in the 10th century, 988 AD. So an English monk and archbishop who died in 988 AD, he wrote a penitential which clearly upholds indissolubility. It says, quote, "He that relinquish his wife and taketh another woman breaketh wedlock. Let none of those rights which belong to Christians be allowed to him, either during life or at his death. Nor let him be buried with Christian men, and let the same be done to a delinquent wife. And let the kindred that were present at the contract suffer the same doom, except they first be converted and earnestly make satisfaction." End quote. So what do we see here? He's clearly discussing divorce and remarriage. He says, taketh another. 2, he's applying this to both genders, both the male, he, as well as the wife, the female. 3rd, excommunication is the penalty for remarriage. So if you get remarried, all rights which belong to Christians are going to be denied for you. And he goes pretty extreme. You aren't getting a Christian burial. You aren't getting any of these rights at all. And then fourth, even attending the second marriages as a layperson, the kindred that were present is what he says, that is forbidden. So that is the same way that Catholics ought to hesitate and seriously do spiritual discernment before they attend marriages they know to be invalid today, which again is the Catholic teaching. This is why Catholics, for example, can't attend same-sex marriages. Even if this is, your best friend, even if this is your sister, you cannot attend invalid marriages to this day. Or conversely, you have to seriously consider the implications for scandal here. And he says that even if you attend the second marriage, you also are going to lose all these rights that belong to Christians unless you are converted, you say, I was wrong, and then you make satisfaction that therefore engage in some sort of penance. He doesn't get into what that penance is, but Archbishop St. Dunstan clearly shows that by the now 10th century, so 988 AD, again, this is 100 years before the schism, this is 100 years before the invasion of the Normans, marital indissolubility is clearly the teaching of the English Church. In the same way that you have Theodore, who was an aberrant archbishop, centuries prior, now you have another Archbishop of Canterbury, and he's clearly teaching the Catholic teaching. So clearly within that interim, whatever Theodore was saying, whatever weird stuff may or may not have been going on, it has been settled. The Council of Hertford, St. Bede, the previous writings we've gone through. Clearly the indissoluble faction was the norm. Clearly they were the stronger force. Clearly the English Church taught marital indissolubility by this time. So now we can talk about the laws of the Northumbrian priests, which would have occurred about the similar time. So this would have been in between 950 and 1050 AD. So in Canon 64 it says, quote, if anyone forsake his lawful wife, as long as she lives, and unlawfully wed another woman, let him not have God's mercy unless he make a bote, or a boat. I don't know how it's pronounced. Canon 65 says, quote, let everyone lawfully keep his wife as long as she lives, unless it be that they both choose with the bishop's council to separate and will thenceforth observe chastity. Now, when we're looking at this first canon here, like when we're interpreting this, there's a clear presumption against remarriage in most cases, but as we see here, it says, unless you make a bote, a penance. And that could mean a couple different things. So the first could be saying this. It could simply be saying that if you're in an adulterous marriage, you're damned unless you repent and you remarry. So you're in an adulterous remarriage. You're damned unless you repent of the sin. So you say, I'm sorry for remarried. And then you say, I'm going to start living a life of chastity. That would be the current Catholic teaching. On the other hand, you could also try to read it as saying, well, actually, maybe you can keep your second wife as long as you do proper penance. And that's what someone who is trying to support divorce and remarriage for adultery would try to go with. So how do we kind of break the tie as to what this means? Well, I say that we should read Canon 64 and 65 together. And in fact, that's what Johnson, and he's the person I pulled this translation from, actually does. He counts Canon 65 as being the same canon as 64, and is actually answering the question of keeping the second wife in the negative. So what he's saying is that every man is required to keep his lawful wife as long as she lives, okay? And if he is given permission to divorce from his bishop, so he says, hey, my wife is engaging in adultery, I want divorce, boom, permission granted, he's now divorced. Canon 65 says, okay, cool, but now you have to observe chastity. So a man's bote, that is if he's remarried, his penance would include giving up sexual relations with his new spouse, ceasing sexual relations, or potentially even giving up the second spouse entirely. So it is clear within the overall context that Canons 64 and 65 are teaching marital indissolubility and the Catholic teaching on divorce and remarriage. So let's talk about the Assembly of Enum, which would have happened in the early 11th century. So once again, before the Great Schism, before the invasion of the Normans. So King Ethelred has basically asked for an assembly of bishops. So once again, we have a large number of clergy present. And the 8th canon concludes, and the 8th canon, if I remember correctly, is actually about incest, but I'm just pulling the last bit for this video today. It says, quote, nor let him who desires to observe God's laws aright and to guard himself against hellfire have more wives than one, but continue with her only so long as she lives. So the canon is making no exception. You have to remain with your spouse as long as she lives. Boom. So that's the Catholic teaching. In 1013, Dane the Canute the Great, he conquered England. So this is significant because you had a significant regime change because, King Ethelred's gone. The kingdom has been conquered by the Danes again. And this ruling is included actually in the Ecclesiastical Laws of Canute in 1017, which shows that the adherence to marital indissolubility was so strong in this region at the time that it could survive even radical regime change. A foreign Danish king, a Viking king coming in and taking over, he's still saying, look, I'm going to take what this rival king was saying and I'm going to put it in my laws because either the Danes believed it really strongly, which would still be evidence for the Catholic position, or the English believed it really strongly, which is still evidence for our position here. So this is another example of marital indissolubility in the English Church. So we're now at the end. It's once again my little tabular summary of how I viewed the sources today. Once again, you're free to come to your own conclusions. I would say that there are approximately 10 sources from the pre-Great Schism, the pre-11th century period, which hold to the Catholic position of marital indissolubility. We have the First Synod of St. Patrick, St. Finian, the Welsh Canons, the Synod of Hertford, the Venerable St. Bede, Cummian's Penitential, St. Adamnan's writings, the Laws of the Northumbrian Priests, St. Dunstan, and the Assembly of Enum. And then as for Lean's Catholic, again, this is the one on Egbert. I think that he has more right than wrong. His theology is correct. You can make an argument for unclear or even Lean's non-Catholic there, but I think Lean Catholic is correct. And then finally, for the sources that are contradicting the Catholic view, we only have 3. We have the Second Synod of St. Patrick, we have St. Theodore of Canterbury, and then we have Howell Da. And you could even make an argument for excluding Da because he's just a secular king. But overall, I hope you enjoyed this kind of impromptu video. I know it's not as polished as a lot of the other stuff I do. I literally just got back from military orders like less than a day ago. So I just kind of tossed this together and I'm just speaking off the hip, shooting from the hip or whatever. So not the most polished video, but hey, hopefully it gives you some content to think about going forward. So thank you. Please like, share, subscribe, whatever jazz you want to do. Thank you for watching. And if I remember, I'll give an update as to the manuscripts that I am writing on this subject, since I know a couple of you are looking forward to that. Thank you and have a blessed rest of your day.